So the second amendment of the 18th edition of BS 7671 was published today, and in this video I'm going to be reacting to some of the main changes that I think stood out. Now there are quite a lot of changes, and I'll probably talk about these in more detail in some upcoming videos, but in the meantime it's always worth familiarising yourself with the changes just to check for any other requirements that may apply for any projects that you're working on. So I'm just going to go through some of the main changes now that I think really stood out. And the thing that stood out for me when I read the press release a little while ago was the method for determining the requirement to provide overvoltage protection. That really stood out for me, and I thought that that's going to be an interesting change. And the news is that the CRL calculation, which was the calculated risk level calculation, which you may remember from the 18th edition 2018 when it was first published, that has been removed completely. And so now basically the requirement is that SPDs are required, but they can be omitted only at the client's request, and however this must be documented. So basically that means you must have a conversation with your client, and if they don't want it for whatever reason, it has to be documented. There are, however, some types of installations that definitely do require surge protection devices, so this is worth bearing in mind, and this will be listed in the wiring regulations. Now, I have to say, I think the removal of the CRL calculation is a good thing because it required a lot of information, and I think lots of people took the view that it was easier just to go ahead and install them. Another thing was that there used to be an exemption for single dwelling units where the cost of the SPD is not justified. And I always thought that this was difficult for us to make that judgment, because if you imagine a typical domestic property, just the cost of replacing the kitchen appliances alone would be more than the cost of installing an SPD. So I thought that was a difficult judgment for us electricians to make. So I think now it's much more simpler, it's much clearer, and I think this is a really good change. So other things that have changed, there's been some changes to the wording around installation resistance testing, which I'm sure I'll talk about more in another video. Another really interesting thing, and quite a big change as well, is around RCD testing. And so now there is a maximum test result of 300 milliamps at 1 times I delta end, and there's no longer a requirement to test at 5 times I delta end or half the cycle. Now this is really interesting. You may remember back in when the 18th edition was first published, the model forms were changed, so there was now 1 column for RCD test. And people often used to ask me, which value do I put in? Do I put at 1 times or 5 times? So I always used to say that we used to put down the 5 times I delta N because that's what was required in chapter 6 of the old regs book. But now it's much clearer. So now we only have to do the 1 times test, and the maximum result being 300 milliamps. And that really clears up a little bit of a grey area that was left when the test sheets were changed from 2 columns down to 1 for RCD tests. Now there are some more changes to the model forms in the new regs book, and so basically the boxes are larger and split over 2 pages, that's for the test results, and also there's an addition of 2 columns, one for RCD type, which is really interesting because obviously you've got type AC, type A, type B, and so on and so forth. So now you can add the type of RCD in there, and there's now an SPD column as well. And the schedule of inspections has been reduced massively. So that's really interesting, and I think that reduces a lot of the work involved in filling out the forms, but there is still the checklist if you want to follow the checklist for the inspection of test results. We do still need to check for these things, but there are now just less boxes to tick in the new form. Now perhaps the biggest change in Amendment 2 of the 18th edition of BS 7671 is the introduction of more requirements with regards to arc fault detection devices, and I think we were expecting this. It was certainly mentioned in the press release before. It's been a topic of discussion, and so now we know that there is an increased requirement for arc fault detection devices on socket circuits not exceeding 32 amps in high risk buildings. Now, when I say high risk buildings, that means above 18 metres or in excess of 6 stories, which is in line with the building safety bill. So we're talking about high rise buildings there. Also HMOs, houses of multiple occupation, student accommodation and care homes. So that is a big change that we're all going to have to get used to. But I think the good thing though is since they were first mentioned in the 18th edition in 2018, the devices have got much smaller. They used to be a double module device, now they're single module, and they're also combined with RCBOs now, which I think is really good. So the technology is obviously improving all the time. Hopefully they'll become more accessible, more readily available and more affordable, hopefully. Now personally, I think that arc fault detection devices are a good thing, because I've seen situations where cables have been damaged but the protected device hasn't operated because there hasn't been a short between live and neutral, or there hasn't been any earth leakage between live and earth. A good example of this is where if you have rodent damage, for example, and so you could have a situation where the cable is arcing but the protected device won't pick that up. but arc fault detection devices can pick that up. So I think it's a really good thing. Obviously it is a big change that everybody's got to get used to, but it should hopefully improve the safety of electrical installations overall, which has got to be a good thing. Another change to look out for is there has been some changes to the wording around bonding, so that's really interesting. It's cleared up a few things, and I'm going to cover this in more detail in a future video. Another interesting change is with regards to the type of RCDs that we're allowed to use. So now type AC RCDs are only permitted for fixed equipment that does not contain any DC components. So in other words, any electronic equipment needs to be protected by at least a type A RCD. Now, if you're not familiar with the types of RCD, type AC RCD is the type that you usually see in a split load consumer unit, and you've got an RCD that's got a little picture of a little sine wave on it. But a type A RCD, and there's also a type B and a type F, they protect against type AC and DC fault currents. So basically the reason for this is because there were concerns about DC fault currents not operating the type AC RCDs. So this is a really important change with regards to the types of RCDs that we select for installations. So another new change is the introduction of chapter 82 of BS 7671, which is about prosumer's low voltage installation. And this may be something that you've heard about before. It's something that's been talked about. Now, a prosumer is an entity that both consumes and produces electricity. So if you imagine an electrical installation that has the electricity supply from the DNO, but also has a renewable energy source such as solar PV, maybe a wind turbine, maybe battery storage, that is a prosumer installation. So that's a whole new chapter for us to take on board. Another change worth mentioning is in chapter 701, which is the chapter for bathrooms and shower rooms. And so you may remember previously it was the wiring regulations were changed to include the addition of socket outlets in bathrooms and shower rooms, provided that they're at least 3 meters away from the boundary of zone 1. This has now been changed and it's reduced to 2.5 meters rather than 3 meters. And this is something that I'm not too sure about this one, I'll be honest. I'm not keen on sockets in bathrooms. That being said, just because I'm not keen on it doesn't mean that you can't do it. You can, as long as it complies with wiring regulations, obviously. So now it's 2.5 meters rather than 3 meters. Let me know what you think about this. Leave us a comment below and let me know, do you agree with sockets in bathrooms? Do you think that 2.5 meters from the boundary of zone 1 is okay? Let me know what you think. Now, I'm sure I'll be making much more videos about the changes in BS 7671, so if you'd like to see those, please click over here to subscribe to my channel.